I guess you've both experienced the same thing that I said, that there's sort of talk about we don't need to retire, or some people can keep working, or so on, and then a noticeable gap between that rather grand aspiration and the sort of concrete things that need to happen. Perhaps each of you would like to pick one thing that you think could happen to make this happen for more people. Dale.
Sure, thanks.
That's not on. Yeah, try the other one.
Maybe we'll try.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Thanks, Helen. I think one thing that we've been seeing in some of our retirement research, and it's a great compliment, some of the surveys that we do to put some real life stories in complement to some of the pure numerical mortality research that we also do as well, to think about what retirement looks like for a lot of different groups of people. I think one of the things that we've been seeing that even employers are thinking about is ways to, not make retirement a 0-1 exercise. Either you're working for us or you're not, but what are ways to wind down hours as people age? And maybe it's a good thing that you have a millennial generation that is looking maybe to ease their way into the workforce as well at the same time. So is there, some of our surveys have shown, is there a way to kind of combine a 40-hour week at age 65 down to a 30-hour week at age 68 or a 20-hour week at age 70 and ramp up a millennial into a partnership and maybe even a mentoring sort of idea as well to get them acclimated to the workforce and then produce a good transition for both ends of the demography.
So these surveys are of workers or of companies or of both?
Most of what we do are of specific individuals. So We've been doing longitudinally now for about 15 years retirement risks and attitudes surveys that highlight, what are pre-retirees thinking about as they reach retirement, and also what are retirees, what risks are they facing once in retirement, and the key things that are shocks to their system once in retirement.
And have you seen much change longitudinally over that time?
Yeah, I think the one thing that pervades it all is that we continue to, as U.S. Americans, to misestimate our longevity, misestimate our life expectancy. We heard earlier, I think it was a good idea for someone to suggest that they want to ban the word retirement, from the language, and I would probably echo it, but also maybe go a step further to say we should ban the word life expectancy or that phrase, because too often it becomes equated with, all right, that's about the time I think I'm going to die, when we know it's really just the median of the overall distribution. So we've been, looking at that data and probably even saying, what's a better phrase or what's a better thing to look at. I often use the word life preparancy as well for like the 90th or 95th percentile of that retirement distribution. What age should we be preparing?
Sorry, just out of curiosity, what is the gap between life expectancy and this 90th or 95th percentile?
In a lot of cases now, it's a good 7 to 10 years.
Right.
So, and just as you highlight how much life expectancy is increasing, life preparancy is really radically going to the right hand of that distribution. So,
this sounds like you should be like pollsters who never put out a number without saying what the confidence interval is.
Right. Why would we just focus on one number when it's only going to be the median of a distribution? Yes. We should focus on, what the risks are for outliving assets all the way to that 90th or 95th percentile. And it's one reason that we've put out a longevity illustrator at longevityillustrator.org in conjunction with the American Academy to help people see what those risks might be.
Mm-hmm. And you work with employers as well to talk about what they can do to make this sort of vision of ramping down a reality.
Well, we also have been doing surveys with employers. We have 3 panel studies that we've done over the last 11, 12 years, and we ask employers to what extent the aging workforce is on their agenda at all, and if so, what are they doing about it? And our most recent, and we find that very few, 18 to 20% of employers are actually thinking of aging workforce as an issue in their employment environment and haven't really thought much about what they should be doing about it.
That seems extraordinary.
Yeah.
This is something that we write about a lot. It's in the papers. We talk about things like demographic time bomb and aging time bomb. How come?
Well, I think we still have this idea of, people turning 50 and starting to pine for, that permanent vacation that retirement still has the reputation of being. And I think we do not anticipate, as Dale was saying, the length of retirement. My mother's been retired for over 40 years, and I don't think anybody ever thought that a pension was supposed to last for 40 years. So I think the attitudes are changing, and there are some forward-thinking employers that are doing things, trying to think ahead about what is going to work. But I think one of the things that we've been talking about is that, and as it was said this morning, you know, we have to start thinking about this with children, with young adults, as they prepare for the arc of life. We need to think differently about work and education and leisure throughout the lifespan, because the way it's been set up is we get education, we get a job, we have a family, we work for 40 years, and then we get to relax, right? But we've been talking more with employers about thinking harder about adding more leisure into the middle years so that parents can share jobs and take care of families. And so that when they do have time for leisure, they have developed some hobbies, some volunteer activities, some other things that are in their lives besides work. Because what we see now a lot is people who have over-specialized in work end up, you know, with financial security in retirement, but a lack of psychological security or a sense that they can still matter, still belong, still contribute to society.
I mean, the way that societies organise themselves via their tax system or by things like mandatory enrolment and pensions and so on have the hugely important result that they get people to do things a lot earlier than they would otherwise. I mean, one of the things we've talked about during the day is how people don't really start thinking about, you know, their own mortality maybe until they're in their 40s or even their 50s. And that's far too late, of course. I mean, as any actuary will tell you. So the point about having a pension system is that you get people doing it before they would think about it voluntarily.
It is, you know, and part of that is even the planning exercise. And, you know, there's clearly lots of places to get education for planning for retirement. You know, whether it's an individual advisor or through your employer, where I think a lot of employers do a very good job trying to educate their employees about here's what's going to happen down the road as you're contemplating that. But I think we're finding, too, in some of our surveys that, you know, only about 40% of pre-retirees say they actually have a plan, and maybe when you get to retirement, only 60% or so have some level of planning of income and expenses, and then shocks occur. And I think our recent survey work showed that, you know, if you look at shocks to the income or expense side when you're in retirement, 7 out of 10 people will have one of those shocks. And normally it's health related. It was amazing in recent surveys how much dental work became, you know, a very big shock to the system, which you know, points that out, but also prescription drugs and other things. But then it's also things like just maintaining your house. You know, a new roof expense can be a very unexpected shock to retirees. So getting better education about those types of things and how you can persist past them is a big part of the retirement story.
Is there any country that the two of you think you'd like to highlight, a particular policy from anywhere? Sorry, I interrupted you. Do make your point, but also think about any places you'd like to draw on lessons from.
Well, I can speak about employers. I mean, that question was asked this morning, and the representative from Germany was here, and BMW stands out as an example of an organization that saw the aging workforce coming, and specifically did focus groups and asked their employees what kinds of things they would need to be able to continue working, and literally revamp the whole system so that their older workers could continue to manufacture cars. And they've been featured in magazines, and it's been all over the news. So there are things that employers can do. The point that I wanted to make, though, was the number of people we're seeing in surveys who say they can't ever retire. So the question that you began with of, are we looking at a retirement-free future? And I just think that's really dangerous thinking, because as Dale was just saying, there are shocks. People have health issues. People have caregiving issues. People's jobs change. People lose jobs. It is just not realistic to think that you can plan for a future that does not include some.
I don't think that people really mean it. I think what they're doing is they're saying it because it's too horrible to contemplate that they actually haven't got a plan.
Oh, I think it's more because they feel like they can't afford it.
No, I know, but they don't know what to do to make themselves able to afford it. So they go, I'm never going to retire. I'll just work till I drop, you know.
Helen, to your question, I mean, we've done similar surveys, not just in the United States, but we've done them in Canada. We recently did a large survey in China. We'll probably do the similar thing in probably 4 or 5 more Asian countries next year. But Canada does tend to stand out as at least being a little bit forward-thinking on some of their retirement philosophies. You know, recently a vote to expand the CPP, the Canada Pension Plan, to cover more middle-income workers, so they're at least thinking about that. How they pay for it may still be a debate, and what employers in Canada do to react to that could probably still be a debate. But you're also seeing some provinces in Canada, I think New Brunswick, it might be an example, where they're laying the foundation or the groundwork for things like target benefit plans. That may not be the full end-all answer, but at least trying to create...
Sorry, I don't know what a target benefit plan is.
Kind of almost a hybrid between defined benefit and defined contribution, which, the payments in retirement vary upon the performance of the plan. So again, it becomes not a 0 or a 1. You either have a strict defined benefit or a strict defined contribution, but some hybrid part of that. And I think other provinces are starting to look at that and ask the question, does that make sense? That theory has also started to get into U.S. policy somewhat, because as multi-employer plans in the United States start to have some real funding issues, one of the proposed solutions, at least, is to look at what they call a composite plan as a new way to keep benefits maybe for new participants going in those types of plans. But this type of plan that allows for still some guaranteed lifetime income in retirement, and it isn't all just, here's a $100,000 check when you retire from your 401k that you now have to figure out what to do with.
Right, okay, so the sort of innovative thinking that perhaps we could have done with maybe 20 or 30 years ago. I mean, it seems to me with pensions more than almost anything else, we get to the stage of, near collapse before we start to do the things that we have to do.
That's true. I think we're sensing that a little bit in the U.S. retirement systems. I mean, you have basically 3 components to it. You have the single employer system, one group of employees per employer, a multi-employer system like the Teamsters or coal miners or grocery workers who might work across, auto workers who might work across a lot of different employers. And then obviously the third is these public plans, which, as we see in the news all the time, have had some funding issues. And the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation here in the U.S. is trying to balance all that. But when something like a multi-employer plan, either is not having success or reaches a funding level, that puts extra stress on this quote-unquote reinsurer of the government, and ultimately will lead to people contemplating what their benefits actually might be from their multi-employer plan in the future. I
mean, it seems like there's an obvious space there to allow people to continue to work, say part-time or whatever, and that would enable us to keep giving people pensions because they would not need so much income from their pension. It seems strange that we haven't managed to make that rather obvious meeting between supply and demand happen. I mean, what are the obstacles?
Well, I think, getting employers on the right page there is probably the best start.
Yes.
Trying to see what policies might need to come up in order to have the flexibility for employers to make those types of decisions.
So, Jacquelyn, what do you hear from employers? What are the obstacles?
Well, one thing is employees do want these things, but they don't want to signal that they're not committed to the work. So if I go to my supervisor and say, I really am interested in sort of phasing out over the next few years, I don't want the supervisor to think that means I'm not as engaged in the work as I have been. So that's an obstacle. And I think creating special programs just for older people, which was also pointed out this morning, is not a good idea either. If you start thinking of giving people what we call career flexibility across the lifespan, then it's a policy that applies equally to everybody, so anybody can scale up or down at any time in the course of working someplace. And that's a little different than phased retirement, which again has a little bit of a bad reputation. A lot of people, places that have phased retirement policies often will ask you to set a deadline by which you will retire. So I'm going to say to my employer, I'm going to retire in 5 years. But I get to the end of 5 years and I like that I'm working less and I've gotten to do the kinds of things I want to do more and the kinds of things I don't less. And I really don't want to leave, but now I've made a promise to leave. So if we frame a policy around what's called career flexibility instead of phased retirement, which only applies to people who are on the way out of the workforce, it makes it just a little bit fairer and less focused on what are we doing about these old workers.
I mean, this reminds me of making things about parental leave and parental policy rather than saying it's maternity leave and maternity policy, which straight away suggests that, women are less committed or...
And that's another thing we find, and this was also said this morning, that if we do something on behalf of older workers, it usually benefits everyone.
Sure.
And these are things that everyone wants. Everyone wants this kind of flexibility.
Have I any questions for my panelists? I think we've hit the sort of afternoon lull. Yeah. Is there any country that you'd point at to say that they had managed to get the conversation with employers particularly well? I mean, you mentioned BMW. I guess you must look at news items that come up from everywhere. Any other stories you think of?
Well, there are lots of forward-thinking employers, and even in the U.S. there are some as well. Government employees, government policy right now is trying to create a phased retirement program of their own. So there are forward-thinking employers in many countries.
Something that I heard last week at the conference was that companies often say one of two things about their older employees. I mean, one of them is that from about 55, whether they realize it or not, they start to think that this person isn't worth investing in because they're going to be leaving. And one of our speakers said that actually, if you look at the data, it's younger people who are more likely to leave. People in their 20s often just shift to another company, whereas someone who's 55, who has a job they're doing well, will probably stay. But then the other thing they sometimes say is, I don't know what we will do without them. That's the other thing. It's one of the two of those, they say.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of intellectual capital, I think,
Yes.
that is within, you know, the over 50, over 55 part of the labor force, especially at a company that, you know, has a long history, and those type of workers have grown up with the history. It's not uncommon, especially in the actuarial profession, for us to say, all right, you know, so tell me how this worked 20 years ago, so I don't run into the same pitfalls or stumbling blocks that I may try to face when I have a new idea that comes up. And I think that's a very valuable thing to try to leverage off of. You know, and I think the comment to employers too is that pensions and any type of retirement plan, whether qualified, you know, non-qualified, or, you know, whether it has lifetime income or not, are good ways to both retain, attract employees into your workforce. If they have some sort of lifetime guarantee, like a defined benefit plan, then they require monitoring, and it's an obligation, a promise that you're making to an employee. And I think our actuarial profession is trying to do a good job to make sure that employers understand what that commitment is, and, you know, how funding of that obligation needs to work. We at the SOA continue to do mortality studies that I think help actuaries have that type of discussion with the employer. And every plan is different depending upon whether you offer robust health and wellness benefits for your employees or the other employee benefits that you may offer. But it's good to have this aggregate starting point to say, here's what private plan mortality is across the United States, and then use that information to make good education and decisions with the employer on how they want to fund that promise that they've made to employees.
I was wondering about the structural question about how pensions interact with the inequalities that we've heard about during the day. So the same person who hasn't been earning much is the same person who's likely have to retire earlier for health-related issues because, you know, maybe they're doing a manual job and you just can't keep doing that into your 60s and 70s. And that's the same person who then therefore has to, you know, have had less time building up retirement income. Whereas, you know, the flexibility is all very well if you've got somebody who's going to have good health and who's going to be able to keep on working and is therefore going to be able to enjoy a bigger income in their retirement because they were able to keep on working. I mean, what do we do about this? It seems like we're compounding inequalities.
I mean, just as we think of historically retirement with this three-legged stool on different sources of income,
Yes.
I think we tend to think of it too as, you know, what makes for a successful retirement in some of those cases. And yeah, financial security is clearly one of the legs of that stool, and maybe health and wellness is another leg of that stool. But I would say, we talked about it here today, that social engagement and volunteerism and other things are another part of that stool as well. There's a great project from the Stanford Center for Longevity that we are a part of called Sightlines, and it tries to measure those types of things, and are we progressing or regressing as a society?
And what are we doing?
Some of those. We're doing okay in some cases.
Mixed.
It is mixed results. You know, financial security, you know, some mixed results. Health and wellness maybe is okay, but, you know, social engagement is probably the one that's probably hardest to measure, for sure. It's a little bit more qualitative than quantitative. But you combine the fact that, 30 years ago, I think about 15% of the households in the United States were just one person. Today, that's probably close to about 30%. And it has the consequences of some of the things we've been discussing on, marriages later and divorce happens more often and a surviving spouse is more apt to be in a one-person household. But you layer onto that, what are the things that are different as well? Well, volunteerism is either level or down, and religious affiliation and community involvement is either level or down. So how do we generate, a level of social engagement that helps solve issues in the situations that you're describing? And is your handheld device a proxy for social engagement, or is it not? I think those questions are yet to be resolved, but making sure that we have a focus on social engagement is a big part of it.
Yeah, that's some work we've been doing is what it means to be engaged in later life. And we have looked at 4 activities: continued work, volunteering, caregiving, and education and training. And we find that when people are involved in any one of those things and very engaged, meaning enthusiastic about it, it gives them energy, it makes them want to get up in the morning, that creates well-being, life satisfaction, all kinds of good things. And there's an interaction with age such that if people are involved in some of those things but not engaged in the way that I described, that's worse for well-being than not doing anything.
So like you have to work but you don't like it, sort of thing. It's interesting you say education, because that's not something that we often say when we're talking about older people. What needs to change there?
Well, again, I think we have to think about education as not just, up through college education and beyond, but education throughout the lifespan, because jobs change, skills need to be changed. People need to start thinking in terms of lifelong learning instead of just the regular schooling pattern that we have. One of the things that we saw in some of our data was that 70% of the people who weren't engaged in any of those activities that I just described report that the main thing they're doing is watching television.
Right.
And so this is not good for them, not for well-being, not for social engagement, and not good for society either. And in this very room, just last February, I heard Mark Friedman talking about the wealth and perspective and education of current generations of people in the age group that we're talking about, and the possibilities there of connecting those people with the great needs of society. And that's something that I think we need a lot more focus on.